Welcome back to France 24. I'm Luke Brown, and this is your business update. Begin here in Europe tonight, where Standard & Poor's has downgraded Greek debt once again. This time by 2 more notches. That puts it at CC, just 2 notches above default, with a negative outlook. Perhaps not much of a surprise. Earlier in the day, boss of Standard & Poor's underlined that the bailout plan announced last week would essentially represent a default. That's because the proposed restructuring demands that private investors accept a 21% haircut on their holdings is basically, according to him, a default on their investments. And it's been a busy day for downgrades here in the Eurozone. Cyprus too, which only joined the single currency back in 2008. Moody's has downgraded the island's sovereign debt by 2 more notches, 3 levels above junk. The credit ratings agency said it was worried about the island's fractious domestic policies. That uncertainty is especially important given Cypriot banks' exposure to Greek debt, amongst the highest in the Eurozone. Moving now to the United States and the debt ceiling debate on the other side of the Atlantic, and yet more news from the credit ratings agency Standard & Poor's. A busy day indeed. Its top execs, as well as Moody's, are being grilled by members of Congress about reforming the sector, but focus is really on Washington's borrowing limit. Devon Sharma from S&P's says his company's analysts don't think a US default is likely. That's a welcome note of reassurance, even as the parties continue to squabble over the numbers. Non-partisan accountants have gone through the figures, and the Republican spending cuts come up $350 billion less than expected, and that will leave arch conservatives like the Tea Party even more dissatisfied, and a deal still distant. Now, that US debt ceiling and the rows do continue as the numbers do not really add up. But one consequence of all that unease surrounding the dollar has been a boost for other currencies. The Swiss franc is at record highs versus the dollar, but the Japanese yen too is riding high as the dollar dropped to a 4-month low, dropping 0.3% early on Wednesday to 77.57 yen. That makes life hard for exporters, and foreign tourists are heading to the land of the rising sun, but not for Japanese holidaymakers heading overseas. Mark Thompson has the details.
Trading in her yen for Canadian dollars. This woman, like many Japanese, is rushing to her local travel agency. A strong yen means big savings abroad. Reservations for South Korea and other Asian nations are up around 10% for the year.
I can buy things pretty cheaply, so it's a good opportunity.
But domestic hoteliers aren't as happy. They are worried tourists scared away by the country's March earthquake are unlikely to return. Those who have made the trip say they are keeping one eye on their pockets.
Sure, we have a small budget, so we are looking at our expenses and we are not spending too much.
Japanese exporters are also suffering. Nissan, which gets around 80% of its revenue overseas, saw its value cut by almost 2%. The strong yen is making their products less competitive and eats into their profits. Pressure is building on Tokyo to curb the strong currency. The government says it's monitoring the situation and refused to rule out a yen-selling intervention.
Now, we've talked about the currencies. Now let's take a look at the markets around the world. In Europe at the close, all down very sharply, with the CAC, Carrant, the DAX and the FTSE in London all vying for the worst performer, from 1.25% down to 1.5% down, as you can see there. The Milan exchange also sharply down, heading towards 3% of losses. The clearest example of the fears of contagion here in the Eurozone. Over in the US, it's a similar story on those ongoing fears around a possible default, with all 3 big indices taking sharp losses. Nasdaq leading the race to the bottom, currently down almost 2%. Now, in another example of the credit ratings clout this evening, Moody's has downgraded Nokia, the company, by 2 notches. That's just 2 levels above junk, and it was put on warning it could go even further. The reason for that, Moody's is not convinced that the Finnish phone maker has a strong enough plan to get it out of its current trough. Nokia has failed to keep up with the smartphone market as Apple overtakes it in sales of the most lucrative handsets. And finally, one for those with good taste and deep pockets. It's a new record for a bottle of wine not sold at auction. That is for a 200-year-old vintage. The 1811 Chateau d'Yquem sold at the London Ritz for €84,000. That's about 1,100 euros a sip, so not for the quaffing. The white wine is a rarity, as it's only one that really gets better with age, which is lucky because a low rainfall back in 1811 is leading to this memorable vintage. The buyer is a Frenchman, and he says he will crack the cork open in 2015. That's all we've got time for in this bulletin. I'll be back with another update in about 20 minutes' time. Do stay tuned to France 24 after the break. More headlines and news.